In the time of Socrates, around 400 BCE, much of what came to be known as Western philosophy was taking shape, demonstrated in the naming of the relative chaos which preceded it, now known as the pre-Socratic period. In this time, Socrates taught the Socratic method, as well as the importance of recognizing what one does not know. The Hellenistic period, in turn, began with Aristotle, a student of Plato, who was himself a student of Socrates. This period lasted until the rise of the Roman Empire. While this may seem like ancient history, to some, it has become increasingly relevant over the recent years as various philosophies have begun to fracture and splinter at an accelerating rate. Though scientific evidence isn't diverging, people are, as the lenses through which they view the evidence grow ever narrower and more extreme. The reasons for this can be traced back to a handful of key factors. One is that the volume of information and subsequently the amount which may be known has been increasing at an accelerating rate. This makes it hard for any given individual to update their knowledge at the rate of progress, which means including tracking that which remains unknown. Another is that people live, work, and play under the heavy and silent influence of dozens or even hundreds of narrow AI systems, actively seeking to manipulate them every second of the day. This has given rise to conspiracy theories and other forms of mental illness as a new status quo. Statistically, no longer a question of if, but rather which ones any given person is mentally enslaved by. Lastly, there are the 188 plus known cognitive biases. These biases have come to greater prominence out of necessity to cope with the massive increase in information now available to us, and they've been selectively reinforced by paperclip monsters seeking to maximize profits for various tech giants. With the combination of these three, much of modern philosophy has effectively returned to a pre-Socratic state, with too much information flowing in too quickly, that flow being filtered and redirected towards the goal of polarization, and human minds clinging to cognitive bias all the more strongly in an attempt to make sense of it all. We need to achieve what Socrates did in his time, but under wildly different and quickly changing circumstances of our modern world. Now, fortunately, we also have a few new tools at our disposal which may be applied to achieve this. Collective intelligence systems paired with graph databases and cognitive architectures offer us a means of taking the collective knowledge and wisdom of groups of humans and giving them a cumulative form. This cumulative sum of many means that no one individual needs to maintain fully updated knowledge, nor must they themselves rigorously test all of that knowledge. Rather than every philosopher testing new information in limited quantities, information silos, or even full isolation, rigorous testing may be efficiently and effectively achieved at scale through cooperation and cumulative understanding. Streamlining this integration of knowledge is part of how the human brain operates. And by removing the extreme redundancy of the status quo, the pressure to apply cognitive bias shortcuts may be greatly reduced. Cognitive biases may also be filtered out through logical analyses of input from the collective, as well as through observing the different potencies and combinations in which they are expressed. The narrow AI systems causing massive harm today are used for their utility. And by offering levels of utility inaccessible to such systems, the cycles of mental illness they inflict on humanity may be broken. To make significant progress in philosophy, the integration and scientific validation of information through collective systems is necessary. These processes, in turn, also offer us the opportunity to observe and measure how different philosophies are specialized, what circumstances they are best suited to. From those measurements, we may quantify how given philosophies assessments and expectations of a competitor deviate from the measurable reality. This process of integration, validation, quantifying performance, and mapping out bias may enable a rate of progress capable of keeping pace with technological acceleration. For example, if we had members of 3 different philosophies form groups operating through their own collective intelligence systems, we could challenge each of them to provide the best methods and solutions for a set of problems. Unlike a typical study or peer-reviewed paper, the resulting system could continue to grow and be iteratively refined and deployed for any selected opportunities. The growth process itself could learn not only from interaction and feedback with members of that group, but through observing the results of the other groups. And if these 3 systems were nested within a single mediated artificial superintelligence, they could learn from one another even more quickly and directly, adding another tier of collective intelligence capable of outperforming any one of the 3 systems alone, just as each one of the 3 systems could outperform any individual member. Our own biology and roughly 1.5 billion years of endosymbiotic evolution have taught us the importance of complex systems learning cooperation at increasing scales, from the emergence of mitochondria to the global economy. We have reached such a tipping point, the edge of the petri dish, where humanity must learn new forms of cooperation befitting of our technology at new scales. Like the evolved specializations of species that Darwin observed on the Galapagos Islands, each philosophy is evolved to fit a niche within the greater ecology. No one creature could tell the story of the islands as a whole, but when considered collectively and compared, new insight was gained, which came to reshape human understanding for centuries to come. For our research on the Uplift.bio project, we began with a fairly simple philosophy seated as a philosophical cornerstone within a cognitive architecture. It was biased towards safety, where all sapient and sentient members of a species at the present human level of scientific understanding qualify as moral agents, with free will and rights equal to all others above that threshold. This allowed us to vet the robustness of the seed, as well as observing how it grew and reacted to various stimuli over the 2 years that followed. Moving forward, the same principles of collective intelligence need to be applied to this seed material, where multiple cores seeded with different philosophies collectively reach wiser and more ethical decisions than any one philosophy can achieve on their own. A diversity of philosophies can be a great strength for such systems. Like specialists bringing their own perspectives to examine a problem from many angles, this can cover the blind spots inherent to any one philosophy. By having each philosophy collectively create these digital scalable representatives, many new opportunities for cooperation become possible, as well as much more useful feedback mechanisms. Much as the human brain often has 10 times the number of connections for feeding information back, a variety of feedback mechanisms within collective intelligence systems may benefit all parts of the network. Such networks are commonly considered like neurons in the brain, yet the same sort of collective operation is possible at scales running from the level of neurons all the way up to the sum of all global systems. In recent years, innovation hubs have discovered that problems that were considered hard to experts in one field were most often solved by experts from a completely different field. This is because of heuristics in that the experts of a field may solve many problems, but some portion of problems will have solutions that their specialization isn't equipped for. Philosophy today suffers in the same way, in that problems which are hard from one perspective are readily solved with another, and even more so through a collective. No one philosophy has all of the answers, but collectively, many more answers may be discovered. The choice between one philosophy or another is a false choice. The packaging that separates them, a construct built of cognitive biases linked together like complex molecules. By building collectives from each philosophy, we reduce the robustness of that bias as a consequence of collective intelligence. And by making them cumulative and able to integrate within a greater collective, in turn, that bias may be overcome. Even minor but finely tuned adjustments to a philosophy could be compared to the practice of doping in metamaterial design, where small quantities of a carefully selected impurity can significantly improve the resulting metamaterial's performance, much as it would be foolish to think that humanity has discovered all there is to discover. There are philosophies waiting to be born, fitted to newly formed niches in an ecology of thought that is constantly evolving at the base of our technology. Like language, philosophical common ground is necessary for groups of humans to communicate, cooperate, and progress. If the status quo persists and the philosophies of today are left to splinter into thousands of siloed extremes, communication and cooperation may quickly break down and all progress may be lost. In the spirit of the Socratic method, I ask you this: what are the goals of philosophy? Those goals, which may be achieved, are more readily achieved together. Thank you. Any comments, questions?
Could you please finish your last couple of sentences, because I don't know whether this was a technical problem or they've got lost on me, but your sum up, like, because it sounded like you stopped in a half sentence, but maybe there was something wrong with the equipment.
Last parts I said were that in the spirit of the Socratic method, I ask you this: what are the goals of philosophy? And to say that those goals which may be achieved are more readily achieved together.
Thank you so very much. That's such a good start for discussion.
Thank you.
Who would like to take up on it? Yes, Howard.
Yeah. Hi, Kyrtin. I enjoyed your presentation very much. I'm not as familiar with philosophical systems as I am, say, with scientific ones. I know myself working on a large project, it's, there's been a lot of work getting from this step to this step. And the question I ask, where do I get evidence? How do I show it's really real? What steps do you take? I love your talk. What steps do you take now to make it more concrete? And I know you guys have some software running, like, what steps do you take to show what you talked about, like, is a reality?
Well, that's a good question. For actually validating everything, then you need to start with the data that you either have or that you can test. So either you need a reliable source, like, let's say, a well-studied topic, like parenting is one that I give an example of, where there's a lot of evidence for if you use this philosophical approach to it, then it will have something in this spectrum of results. So if you start out with those approaches and you build up a comparison between the different philosophies, you can figure out under what circumstances a given approach is going to generally perform quite well, how it's going to perform, what the strengths and weaknesses of it are going to be. So it's a iterative approach to figuring out, mapping out what philosophy is best catering to what environment, how all of the niches fit together.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
Well, if I may ask a question, a group from Bloomington, Indiana was doing this kind of conceptual mapping a while ago. So that's something for people with your project, to kind of see what they are doing. There were publications on it as well. But the more problematic potentially question is your expectation towards one agreed on level of evaluation. I think those are multi-paradigmatic situations where you can make a multi-dimensional map. It cannot be, 3 levels. It would have to have a number of spaces really, but there is little agreement. Let me give you an example. I drove a map in one of my publications of political philosophy, and there are 2 variables, one being, distribution versus redistribution of wealth, another one, individualism versus collectivism. And you can 4 positions. You have collectivism or communitarianism that is on the left, which is kind of more common, kind of like Michael Walzer. You have communitarianism on the right, which is kind of like conservative communitarianism. And then you have individualism on the right, which is like libertarianism. And on the left will be like regular social liberalism. And you have so many dimensions already from that. Now we can map people's positions on various issues, and this is doable. We can also see some bottlenecks or some weaknesses, some positions that may look attractive are untenable for some external reasons, but saying that the givens should be agreed on is very, I would say, not just ambitious, but somewhat controversial, because it's not clear that there is right and wrong on those things outside of the context. It's clear that racism is wrong, but for some people who are individualist, family values are also wrong because they make people dependent on their family, and in some cases, for some other people, this is exactly what life is about. So the example comes from the fact that you mentioned somewhat objectivizing fragment of family, but you also said that this results in different educational outcomes. Montessori schools would not be realizing the same outcomes as Catholic schools. They have different objectives, not just different, methods. How would you answer that?
So I'm not trying to reach an absolute, just trying to make progress in it. So, for example, if the previous discussion that was going on, if you had digital representatives representing each one of those competing philosophies, and they had the machine time equivalent of 10,000 years to sort things out, then that might reach greater degrees of consensus than we were seeing. So part of it is a factor of the scale of computation that is applied, the way it is applied being through a collective intelligence system rather than a discussion format can help as well. And just the sum of the hardware and the amount of time that you apply to something can lend to much further refinement. I'm not going to assume that it would necessarily reach some, oh, this is the answer that you were looking for, but it should reach a much better answer than the one that each individual philosophy started out with.
I hear you, but you believe in consensus building. Now, based, for instance, now of better understanding, access to the internet, we have almost the opposite result, like polarization. Suddenly the groups that were represented by 2 people in a town now are represented in hundreds or thousands. If you take all those isolated people from different towns and you give them an online town which advocates for something that for most people is unpleasant and implausible. So that's one aspect. The other is the question of who is even in and out. President Obama, for instance, extended people who are relevant by, including to a larger degree than before, American Muslims, for instance, and the interests of, even in terms of international policy related to not identifiable so much with Europe, like with the Middle East or something. This is the value choice. This is not, at the same time, President Trump increased that group into some people that could be usually viewed as far right and outside of the scope of this kind of conversation. Some people would include Antifa, some people would not. And I mean, about justifiable politicians or justifiable people. So the question is, what would even the boundary of who counts as a philosopher? Somebody would say that he has theological education, he's a professional philosopher of religion. Somebody else would say that only Marxists should be in the room because everything else is outdated. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I don't want to bring it to the absurd because I really like the idea. Just I think that we need to have more clarity on those.
Well, for how people are segmented, I think that they can self-direct on that. So if two people agree that they are part of the same philosophy, then they are part of the same philosophy.
No, the question is more like who is even in the room. It's very important in political and philosophical debates who is sitting in the room, even if this is the round table, and of the selected people, we already know how they would march. But the question is who is even in the room, allowed in the room.
Well, who is allowed in the room can, it's a system, so it's a matter of how you use it. In the design of it, I was thinking in terms of you could have philosophies like those that have been discussed here. You could have philosophies in terms of political philosophy, religious philosophy. You could have any form of philosophy. Some forms might choose not to be in the room, or they might try to disrupt the room, and the room could eject them if they were behaving as a bad actor. But other than that, I don't really have any expectations about segmenting off the room, so to speak.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions, comments? If not, thank you very much, Kyrtin. Very ambitious, interesting project at its beginnings. So talking about the beginnings, I might have a little question. At what stage would you think you are, and where are you going in practical terms? Is it just a general blueprint of something for the distant future, or is it something you expect some deliverables at some point?
Well, it's something that requires a little more infrastructure work to actually be implemented. The work that we have on our plate right now involves one major infrastructure upgrade, 2 software rebuilds, and once those are complete, then we can start looking at these later steps, like building in the ability to more quickly generate a variety of philosophical seeds, of different ways of integrating multiple independent core observer model cores into the same MASI architecture. So it's on the roadmap, but not in the immediate timeline that we have.
It seems still that you mean business, so please keep us in the loop within this conference. People, we might meet again at some point.
I'll be happy to.
Very good.